So thanks very much for your kind words of introduction and also for inviting me to participate in this debate in this really strange and troublesome moment in time where we all sit at home or wherever and try to nevertheless make our neurons work and exchange, etc. I'm also particularly pleased that I can follow Lorraine's talk, because in many ways it kind of triggered some thinking about how my work complements and speaks to what you just have outlined. In particular, I was struck, and I just want to say that as a comment to the talk, I was struck by your example you took from the astronomical community and from these large kind of experimental setups. And I think it is really worthwhile to think about what we mean when we call something a project, and how the time frames of astronomical work is fundamentally different to maybe 90% of other, and of CERN also, and all the other big science places, how they differ. And I think at the end of my talk, I might say a couple of words about that, because I really found that fascinating and it got my kind of thinking work. So the title of today's presentation is The Temporal Politics of Merit, which in 4 words tries to bring my key argument to the point. If we want to reflect and unpack this fuzzy concept of merit, we need to first consider how contemporary academia has been undergoing a deep retiming, and then ask how this has impacted the way we conceptualize merit, we acknowledge it, we measure it, we reward it, and how this is then reconfiguring both how we know and what we want to know and how we live in academic systems. Retiming is not something that is situated solely within the research system, but is a clear sign of how the boundaries of academia have become more permeable to wider societal changes. And I think that is where I come from. My short analysis, which I want to present today, is actually based on a series of projects I've been carrying out over nearly 15 years now, predominantly covering the fields of the life sciences, physics, environmental research, and sociology. They investigated, taking different angles, changes in academic lives, institutional environments, as well as how all this relates to the ways of knowing that we are capable to develop. When listening to the stories of researchers shared with me in more than 150 long interview conversations done in the course of this project, and a considerable number of discussion groups we held, it was really striking to me, without having been specifically invited, how much they talk about time. So they talk about practices of managing, squeezing, offering, buying, wasting, and sometimes they speak even of stealing time. Somebody told this nice story about how she will steal time during the week to have some reading time on Friday. So I found that interesting, like to conceptualize time. They refer to their sabbaticals as special moments when they, I quote, have time to do those things that are close to their heart, which seems to have not sufficient space in their everyday experience. They throw into the conversation that things take their time, pointing to the fact that every element and process has its own speed and rhythm, which sometimes does not fit into academia. They describe their struggles with sheer endless deadlines and time pressures, or their feeling of being constantly out of time in the double sense of the term, namely not being in time and lacking time. Or they reflect on the feeling of uncertainty with regard to the relation of their achievements and their point in their academic life they are in particular when they have to look at their CVs for reasons of having to apply for the next job or the next grant. While these stories are often only rather fragmented parts, snippets in a wider narrative on their lives in science, they seem to play an important role on how they make sense of themselves and the lives they are living in academic research. Their talking about time tells us about how they see their institutions, be it their universities, the journals they write for, or the funding agencies they get their funding from, how they experience the specific place they are in, the broader scientific culture, but also the scientific citizenship experiences they have. So how is science embedded in society? Yet it also tells us how they govern through time and are governed by time. It gives us access to important parts of their identity work, allowing us to reflect on current power relations at work in academic environments. So here is the very short story we'll be telling you in the next 20 minutes. I will start with the amorphous, fuzzy, situated concept of merit that has a history, different expressions, and shifts over time. In a way, for me, it is a container notion, and so I will not define it in any way in the beginning, the content of which is decided in a very situated manner. And I think Lorraine gave really nice examples, how we can see that, both how it changed over time, but how is it also happening in different places and in different situations. But it is always also a normative ideal that we are striving for in the sense to achieve a just academic system that gives the rewards for the merits. So why is it important to try to understand merit in that sense, as it's often expressed as objective and trusting in the numbers we see, and this has already been critically remarked? It's because it has become a justificatory, part of a dominant justificatory narrative used in academia in the context of distribution of resources, in or exclusion, feeling of belonging, and many more. So it's this justification I'm interested in, that merit is used, or a specific form of merit and understanding is used to justify choices. This is then tied to the dominant governance logic, which I want to label academic capitalism, as many others have done so. But I will say a few words about my understanding of this term, which I think is really essential. All this together defines which lives are possible in science and which epistemic living spaces can be carved out and inhabited, a concept I will say more about in a minute. Now, so my hypothesis, academia goes through a period of fundamental retiming, and where the temporal politics or the chronopolitics is a key dynamic to understand when wanting to reflect what merit actually means. All this, and this is my broader STS framing, has to be read from a co-productionist perspective that outlines or highlights how inseparably intertwined are our ways of living in the world and knowing and representing this world. And I think this was also nicely visible in Lauren's presentation. Now, let me say a few words about this concept of epistemic living spaces. So understanding merit in practice, I would like to think it together with this concept, which was developed in a comparative European research project that looked into academic developments. Developed out of interviews with researchers, it is a narrative concept. So we look at the way how scientists narrate their lives, and it refers to the multidimensional material and imagined space our interviewees refer to, a space which molds, guides, delimits, in more or less subtle ways, researchers' interactions, what they aim to know, the degrees of agency they have, and how they can produce knowledge. In the tradition of Czerniawska and others, I understand interviews then as a form of storytelling, and thus as a window in the social, epistemic, political, and symbolic, but also temporalized lives of research. The notion of space was thus a result of analyzing the narratives of researchers, a notion used by interviewees, sometimes metaphorically, sometimes materially, and sometimes to describe also the social space they have. This space would capture their room for maneuver, their ways of feeling intellectually and socially at home, holding an understanding of the often non-codified set of values which matter, feeling subjected to, being part of, and performing certain temporal regimes, tacitly sharing a repertoire of practices to address knowledge questions, and adapting to specific, often complex funding arrangements. And I could add a lot of things. In that sense, I see space much less as already existing setting for such stories, but much rather the space is assembled through and brought into being through the very act of thinking about their lives and making and narrating it. I identified 5 inextricably, or maybe 5 to 6 inextricably intertwined dimensions. Of course, the epistemic one that points to the kinds of questions they think they can ask and how they can look for answers. A material one that captures the kinds of availabilities and affordances a system gives to them. A temporal one, to which I will be focusing today, a symbolic but also values-oriented, and a social and cultural. The temporal aspects bring into focus of today's presentation that these research environments have to become hospitable to academic work and life and cannot be seen as fixed and given. So researchers are all the time asked to become entrepreneurial architects in a way, to rearrange and align themselves with these elements in their environment and manage related uncertainties. This brings me to this notion of academic capitalism, and I would, which is an essential framing to understand the concept of merit, I think. However, as I said, I want to broaden it. It seems important to analytically separate monetary or market value from other cultural ways of ascribing worth. Here I follow Michel Lamont's argument, and to analyze also with Boltanski and Thévenot's framing the different registers of worth that actors in a specific domain can draw on to inform, to orient, and to justify their actions. And of course, as we have seen in the debate before, the narrower these registers of worth become. So if it's only about the numbers of papers of et cetera, the less you can play around with argumentative resources, you have argumentative resources of another kind. And you cannot justify actions or choices. This means that academic capitalism needs to be dissociated from the narrow view that it is about relations to classical economic actors, which is also important, or only about questions of accumulation of capital in a Latourian sense. This invites us to open up our understanding and to investigate the multiple regimes of accumulation. Drawing on my colleague Maximilian Fochler's recent work on variants of capitalism in research, we need to carefully look into the multiple institutionalized discourses and practices, the material objects and infrastructures, as well as the people living in, complying with, and resisting these very regimes. Therefore, we are invited to more carefully differentiate regimes of accumulation from regimes of valuation. So we have regimes of accumulation that you get certain resources, but then you also have regimes of valuation, and we have to think which of these things do we value more, and we have to dissociate them and not just look at accumulation and put it equal to valuation. I think that is one of the problems we discussed before about if the number of papers is the quality of a researcher. Then we have conflated the regime of accumulation with the regime of valuation or evaluation. Researchers also value other elements of their work which are not necessarily leading to a straightforward competitive advantage. And this is important to keep in mind. And this also refers to this woolly and fuzzy thing of the ethos, because it's all this what ties us together. This takes us back to the question of temporalities, of course, because they matter in very different ways in these two regimes, as we will see. So, and in fact, it's that kind of nice to think about how capitalism is tied to time. If we look at, for example, labor time as crucial factor of production, or if we think of time leads over competitors as a key element of market competition. And I find it interesting that today publications in key journals are embargoed to have the newsworthiness as one point in time, which is a really strange twist we have given to the way we communicate our findings. Now, in that sense, I would refer to Jeremy Rifkin's quote, "Time is our window on the world. With time, we create order and shape the kind of world we live in. Every culture, and so the scientific culture, has its unique set of temporal fingerprints. To know a people is to know the time values they live by." So if you want to know scientists, we have to understand the time values they live by. So, and that brings me to Barbara Adams' words, where she says, looking at through the lens of time means to touch the deep structure of social and institutional processes that other social theories can't reach. So, analyzing change in academic environment, we can witness the major problems identified in academia, often lead to the introduction of new temporal regimes and related indicators, defining and measuring achievements. Just think about the evaluation culture. When people thought like, okay, there is something going wrong, so we do a 5 years evaluation of everything and anything that is existing in an institution like in mine, for example. This is guided by and allows to perform values of efficiency, of self-control, transparency, and the promise of manageability, which is very important to today's academia, apparently. Thus, understanding the multiple temporal dimensions that explicitly and tacitly govern contemporary academic research, as well as individual and collective lives in it, allows us to grasp the complex relations of governance, power, and academic identities. For that purpose, we have to look at so-called time generations, a notion coined by the historian Rindersbacher. And time generators are key sites which create binding temporal requirements and regulations. And close scrutiny also points us to the fact that we witness a rather uncoordinated multiplication of time generators, and I will mention in a minute a number of them, in different places and by different actors, leading to the coexistence of ever new, not aligned temporalities. Time thus comes in multiple forms, in different regimes of valuation and accumulation. So we have to look for both, how that matters. And it is thus telling to investigate the complex dynamics of how researchers work with, for, against temporal orders and related structure. Now, let me just give you some example, and they will ring immediately a bell. The project as a key principle of organizing research that actually distributes the money, whether we have enough or not. There are different visions on that. But of course, it's the project that is the key distributor here. We have accountability exercises. So every now and then we have evaluations. We have impact discourses. We have career planning. We have now CV writing workshops. And we have acceptable forms of precarity that we have defined as okay for us. Even the excellence discourse piggybacks on the fact that we draw many people into science just to keep very few of them in stable positions. So that is an interesting way to look at it. Data infrastructures such as the Web of Science has produced indicators, and indicators are nothing. For example, the impact factor is nothing than citations per time unit. So again, it matters how fast you are cited, and et cetera, et cetera. So rankings are then developments over time. They allow you to see any institution on a trajectory, upwards, flat, downwards, etc. Time apps for students are now circulating, trying to teach them, under quotation mark, early on how to best use their time. So they all together, in one way or another, perform the concept of merit. And I think this is important to keep in mind, that merit is not something that abstractly exists out of these practices, but that merit gets meaning and becomes performative and powerful through all these different processes. Let me shortly zoom into one such time generator, which has become so normalized that academic life could not even be imagined without it any longer, even though in this form of it's a child of the second half of 20th century, namely the research project. And I'm not speaking of the kind of research project Lorraine was speaking to, namely the astrophysicists that have a lot of time to do research over 10, 15 years to develop something. I'm speaking of the research projects that have generally run 2 to 4 years, that you have to redemand the money in order to be able to run your basic research, because no university gives you enough money with a few exceptions of fields where you can do your research without external funding. So Mehler and co-authors describes this very aptly as a colonization of research by project-related principles, rules, techniques, and procedures, aspiring to form a new iron cage of project rationality. Therefore, we now have something like roadmaps, which I did not know about when I was a student, which a while ago, but okay. We define milestones, we fix deadlines, we introduce time-knowledge equivalence because we have to calculate how many person months will we need in order to achieve exactly this promised piece of knowledge. They have become key notions in the discourse capturing research. In the European context, the European Commission research projects have taken a leading role in all this, putting in place a hugely complex system of accounting, an excellent example of what Power has called an audit society. But more importantly, the emergence of projects has shifted the relation between different kinds of workforce. We have seen the emergence of a whole new category of researchers who temporarily join the academic institutions as project collaborators through selling their time and us buying it. Thinking in equivalence of knowledge and time has then made us limit our intellectual projects to what Joan Fujimura has called doable problems, which can be solved in a limited amount of project time. And we are striving for epistemic things, to use Jörg Reinberger's notion, that perform specific temporalities that support the timing of research. So when you look at the amazement around CRISPR as a method, the majority of scientists said right from the start, this is great. Now we can speed up the production of our units we need in our lab research. And so we can have things at disposition, which formerly took 2-3 years to develop. I can now have it quasi instantaneously, which was interesting for me. So overall, we can see that we move from an exploratory to an exploitative learning in academia. But we should not overlook the invisible work that needs to be done to articulate these different projects and the chunks of time. And I think that's important because we have to ask who can afford this integration work and thus develop a biography of a researcher, an identity in it. If you have to jump from project to project because that's your livelihood, then you become a very different being than if you have a stable position from which you can align them together. Now, the second closely connected dimension is then the creation of new theaters and rhythms of accountability. Changing time structures and new rhythms of accountability also chart new territories where and moments when accountability needs to be performed. For example, the performative character of indicators, as I already said, which all come with some sort of temporal imaginary embedded in them to define merit, allows us only to tell specific stories and to justify specific decisions and investments. And in that sense, only what is countable has a chance to be counted. And we lose out a lot of work and thoughts that are not fitting into this kind of performative character of indicators. And Lorraine's example was wonderful that many funding agencies now ask you the 5 most important ones. But as a long-standing reviewer for the ERC and panel member, I find it always amusing that you highlight your best papers, and then you say, these are my 5 best papers out of the 105 I have written, and out of which an H factor of blah, blah, blah has resulted. So it's so fascinating to see that we embrace the quality while performing the quantity. This requests from us to produce different sets of narratives, put different areas of academic activities in focus, and sometimes also demands new techniques of performing evidence for what has been achieved. And storytelling about the perfectness of one's achievements is something to be studied over time, which I find fascinating. So the specific types of temporalities can gain prominence and are actually valued along these lines. Okay. Now, I want to touch on something which I find particularly interesting because it's so nicely contradicting. While many parts of this story speak to an apparent acceleration, we hear a lot about pressure and we need to be swift and first and everything. We also find a growth of complexities of so-called waiting games. And I find this interesting to look at both. So at the competition talk on the one hand, on the other hand, this talk about the right time for things. So this windows of opportunity talk we feel. And I think it's so important. And this is from Nature. Scientists are becoming increasingly frustrated by how long it seems to take to publish paper. But is it really getting worse, etc.? But it's how the different times come together would be my argument. It's not about just one piece of time, namely the publication time, but it's the career times, the assessment times, and all. So, and this kind of, we should go back to Bourdieu, where he says so nicely, waiting is one of the privileged ways of experience the effect of power and the link between time and power. It follows the art of making people wait, of delaying without destroying hope, of adjourning without totally disappointing. This is an integral part of exercise of power, an art of keeping people motivated, an art of turning down without turning off, of keeping people motivated without driving them to despair. And that is an interesting way to reflect how we deal with a younger generation of scientists in particular. I think this is the citation which I would give to many life stories I have been seeing. Keep them close, promise, but not too much. Keep them, don't make them despair because there might be a window of opportunity, etc. So this is really important because we see it becomes more and more complex to realize a biographical ideal. So who do I want to become as an academic? Because they are often deferred to a later stage when I'm stabilized. And that's one form of a waiting game. So people do everything until they get a stable position. And then they realize, I quote, anyway, now it's also too late because now we cannot do the things anymore. We have to be the ones who manages to get the money, etc., etc. Now, that brings me to a point that rhythm of production, reporting, and assessing of lives and careers in research, as well as of project and publication science, do not easily align at all. They create enormous asynchronicities, the feeling of never being in time. And this points to a loss of opportunities to act, the feeling of not being at the right moment here and now. And we have also to realize that exercising specific kinds of temporalities, we see new forms of exclusions emerge. Because, to quote in a rarity, they can be understood in terms of not being allowed to coordinate one's time with the systemic time in which vital opportunities such as power, employment, or recognition are negotiated. And here I can draw on interesting findings from the gender studies, where it was nicely pointed at putting meetings or internal exchanges at times where people with caring obligations cannot participate is a perfect way of exclusion without officially doing so. So you don't see the opportunities that where you can act, and therefore this is a soft form of exclusion. I mean, it's a very hard, but at the same time, a soft form of exclusion. So this brings me to my concluding thoughts, which have a lot of loose ends. First, I think it's important to understand the polyrhythmicity and the emergent asynchronicities, and that they create the feeling of living in a misaligned and hyperfragmentic epistemic living space, which creates tacit exclusion. So people who leave because they don't feel at home, they don't feel a suitable place to be. I think this is essential because that puts in question the whole talk about merit and reward. Because if people do not feel that this is the place they want to be, then the question of what does merit then mean and what does reward mean is really something to post. We have to understand the multi-sided, often tacit form of governance through time, which raises questions of who has to care for temporalities. And we have to ask the question of responsibility in new way. And at the end, my argument would be the way we looking through time in academia shows us how multiple and situated, reconfigured the very notion of merit has become, how it has been limited to this narrow idea of measurement and to a form of objectivity that actually is in a terrible misfit with what is actually driving knowledge creation at its heart. Thank you.